The hypocrisy is astonishing. The words hit the chamber like a thunderclap. JD Vance's voice cut through the stale air of the Senate floor, sharp and deliberate, carrying the weight of every frustration Americans had bottled up. Cameras zoomed in, microphones crackled, and suddenly every eye in the room turned not toward the majority party, not toward the press gallery, but directly at him. For a split second, silence reigned. Even those who usually scoffed or rolled their eyes when he spoke seemed caught off guard. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't grandstanding. He was laying down a truth so raw, so undeniable, that the room itself seemed to shudder. The same people who lecture this country about fairness, about equality, about playing by the rules are the very ones breaking them when it suits. Their own power, his, tone dripped with a calm fury, a righteous indignation that seemed to slice through the polished performances of politics. The reaction was instant. Democrats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering, others smirking nervously, as if trying to brush off the sting. But the cameras caught it all: the darting eyes, the clenched jaws, the nervous tics that betrayed the confrontation. They had not expected this moment, not like this, not now. And outside those walls, millions watching online leaned closer to their screens. Tweets began to fly. Texts buzzed through group chats. People who normally ignored politics paused mid-scroll, replaying the clip, rewinding the words. The hypocrisy is astonishing. It wasn't just another speech. It was a line in the sand, a challenge hurled straight into the heart of a party that prided itself on moral superiority. And in that instant, JD Vance didn't sound like a politician rehearsing talking points. He sounded like a man holding up a mirror, forcing his opponents and the nation to stare at a reflection they desperately wanted to avoid. But the moment wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The chamber would not remain silent. The pushback, the justifications, the unraveling, it was all yet to come. And as the cameras kept rolling, one truth lingered in the air. This confrontation was about to tear away the mask of respectability and reveal something far more shocking. But this was only the beginning of a confrontation that would expose hypocrisy on the grand stage. Hypocrisy has always been the silent poison of politics, the rot that eats away at trust long before anyone notices the cracks. But in this moment, at this time in America's fragile history, it carried a weight unlike ever before. The country wasn't just divided. It was fraying, stretched thin between competing visions of who gets to define truth, who gets to claim the mantle of justice, and who gets to call themselves the real voice of the people. For years, Democrats had wrapped themselves in the banner of moral authority. They were the party of fairness, of compassion, of rules and norms. They preached equality on television screens, shouted about accountability from rally stages, and promised ordinary Americans that they stood against corruption. And yet, as JD Vance laid bare, those same promises were undercut by a constant stream of contradictions. Rules seemed sacred until bending them offered political advantage. Fairness seemed urgent until it risked undermining their power. Equality was non-negotiable until double standards could be quietly swept under the rug. This wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. It was personal for millions, For working families who were told to sacrifice while elites enriched themselves. For immigrants who were praised in speeches but vilified when inconvenient. For voters who were promised transparency, only to watch deals struck in backrooms while the cameras were turned away. Vance's words landed not just because they were sharp, but because they echoed what so many Americans had felt in their bones. That those who claimed the moral high ground had started to slip in the mud of their own making, and the timing could not have been more electric. With elections looming, with trust in government at historic lows, and with the nation's cultural battles spilling into every classroom, newsroom, and family dinner table, hypocrisy wasn't just an insult. It was a weapon, one that could shape the future of power in America. This wasn't just about a speech, the commentators whispered later. This was about who gets to define America's truth. And that truth was no longer a neutral playing field. It was a battleground where the stakes were not only votes, but values. To progressive listeners, the accusation cut differently. Hypocrisy meant betrayal of ideals they cherished, values like justice, dignity, and compassion that were supposed to define American progress. For others, it was proof that the party's polished image was crumbling, that their so-called guardianship of democracy was nothing more than performance. Inside the chamber, Democrats shifted between indignation and dismissive laughter, but their body language betrayed them. Outside, the public was already reacting in real time, replaying the clip, dissecting every expression, every nervous glance. On social media, hashtags started climbing. Journalists prepped instant analyses. Allies prepared counterpoints. But it was too late. The soundbite had escaped, raw and unfiltered, into the bloodstream of American discourse. And yet, beneath the outrage and the applause, one question lingered. If the self-proclaimed defenders of fairness were guilty of the very sin they condemned, what did that mean for the future of the party, for the country itself? Even seasoned commentators, hardened by decades of political theater, admitted they had not seen this one coming. Vance hadn't just spoken. He had detonated a truth bomb in the heart of Washington, and the aftershocks were just beginning to ripple outward. What happens next left even seasoned commentators stunned. To understand the full weight of JD Vance's confrontation, you first have to see the antagonist in stark relief. The Democrats, long hailed as champions of fairness and moral authority, were not faceless opponents. They were the embodiment of contradictions, a collection of statements and promises that rarely aligned with action. Their words painted a picture of unwavering principles, yet their deeds told a different story. They spoke constantly of equality, yet policies often favored insiders over ordinary citizens. They preached accountability, yet scandals, financial, ethical, and political, were quietly managed or swept aside. On television, they raised their voices about protecting the vulnerable, defending immigrants, advocating for working families. In practice, these same families watched opportunities slip away as deals were made behind closed doors, loopholes exploited, and promises deferred indefinitely. The disparity between rhetoric and reality was glaring, and it festered quietly in the minds of the public until a voice like Vance's made it impossible to ignore. Consider the double standards that had accumulated over the years. Leaders who demanded strict adherence to rules from opponents regularly bent or ignored them when convenient. Campaigns that decried corporate influence were quietly funded by the very corporations they condemned. Cultural battles were waged on social media, where outrage was performative and condemnation selective, never universal, always strategic. The hypocrisy was systemic, not accidental, and it became a narrative in itself. A party more in love with its image than its ideals. The arrogance of this approach was palpable. Within the halls of power, entitlement festered. Decisions were made not for the people who elected them, but for the preservation of influence, prestige, and control. Meetings behind closed doors, lavish retreats, and strategic messaging replaced meaningful service. Public statements were crafted for optics, moral positions taken for headlines, and yet, when challenged, these same leaders leaned into deflection, accusation, and blame. The sense of untouchable authority created a bubble where criticism was not just unwelcome, it was incomprehensible. The frustration this generated among ordinary citizens was deep and visceral. Voters watched as the promises of representation collided with the reality of political gamesmanship. Immigrants who had been welcomed in speeches felt vilified in policy debates. Working-class Americans who were lauded as the backbone of the nation saw their hardships trivialized, and progressive-leaning observers who believed in the values of dignity, justice, and inclusion could not reconcile the public-facing virtue with private compromises. Anger simmered, resentment grew, and the stage was set for someone to expose the contradictions with clarity, courage, and precision. The pattern of hypocrisy extended beyond domestic policy. International stances revealed similar inconsistencies, one day championing human rights abroad, the next turning a blind eye to selective abuses when politically inconvenient. Cultural battles were waged unevenly. Those aligned with the party's narrative were defended relentlessly, while dissenting voices were marginalized or ridiculed. For citizens paying attention, the cognitive dissonance was exhausting, even infuriating. It was not merely mistakes that defined this antagonist, it was the sense of moral superiority wielded as armor. In public forums, leaders projected righteousness, yet in private, ambition and self-interest quietly dictated choices. Their behavior illustrated entitlement, and every broken promise added weight to the perception that power had become an end in itself. The contradictions were undeniable, yet those within the bubble seemed impervious to scrutiny. And just when it seemed they couldn't be cornered, when it felt as if arrogance and entitlement would go unchallenged, JD Vance stepped in. JD Vance's story begins far from the polished corridors of Washington, D.C., or the lecture halls of Ivy League universities. It begins in the industrial heartland of Ohio, in towns marked by shuttered factories, struggling families, and the quiet desperation of communities left behind. Life there was not a narrative for headlines. It was a daily grind, a constant battle against circumstances beyond one's control. And it was in that very struggle that Vance first learned the lessons that would later define him. Raised in a working-class family, he witnessed both resilience and hardship firsthand. His mother juggled multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, while his grandparents provided stability in a world that often felt unstable. He saw friends and neighbors wrestle with addiction, poverty, and the frustration of dreams deferred. The American promise felt distant, even unattainable. Yet the people around him carried hope in quiet, stubborn ways. It was a world that demanded toughness, honesty, and perseverance, not the polished rhetoric of politicians, but the kind of authenticity forged in lived experience. Vance's journey was neither smooth nor conventional. He joined the Marine Corps, stepping into a world of discipline, sacrifice, and rigorous expectation. The military shaped his character, teaching him the value of duty, the necessity of courage, and the importance of loyalty. It also gave him perspective. He understood both the potential of America and the reality of its failings. He knew that ideals alone were insufficient. Action mattered, and he carried that understanding forward, determined to bridge the gap between principle and practice. After his service, he pursued education with the same intensity that had defined his military tenure. He navigated elite institutions that were worlds apart from the towns of his youth, earning degrees in law and business. It was a world of privilege, debate, and opportunity, but also a world where he felt the tension between his roots and the academic elite. This dual perspective became his strength. He could speak fluently in corridors of power while never losing touch with the communities that shaped him. He understood the divide between policy and reality, between abstract ideas and the human lives they affected. The publication of his best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, catapulted him into national prominence. Readers across the country saw themselves in his story, the struggles of overlooked communities, the complexity of cultural and economic decay, the resilience of ordinary people. He became a voice not just for himself, but for millions who had been marginalized, dismissed, or misunderstood. In a world dominated by sound bites and simplified narratives, Vance brought nuance, empathy, and honesty. His authenticity was magnetic. It transcended partisan lines because it resonated with lived experience. By the time he ran for office, he had become a figure who carried not just his story, but the stories of millions who felt forgotten. His campaign was rooted in reality. He spoke directly to voters about their struggles, their fears, their aspirations. He did not promise abstract victories or political theater. He offered recognition, acknowledgement, and a commitment to bridge the gap between the halls of power and the streets of Ohio. His relatability, his lived knowledge of struggle and perseverance, built admiration not just for his intellect, but for his courage. Yet what made him compelling was not only his experience, but his moral clarity. He did not shy away from hard truths, even when they were unpopular. He challenged assumptions, confronted contradictions, and demanded honesty both from himself and from those around him. This willingness to speak plainly, to resist the temptation of empty rhetoric, created a sense of emotional empathy among audiences. People didn't just hear him, they felt him. They recognized in his words the reflection of their own lives, their own frustrations, their own hopes. Through every stage of his journey Ohio's industrial towns, the rigors of military life, the elite classrooms, the national spotlight, Vance's story remained grounded in authenticity. He understood America not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing network of communities, families, and individuals striving for dignity and opportunity. He knew the stakes of political debate not as theory, but as lived reality, and now, standing at the threshold of a confrontation that would dominate headlines, he was armed not with scripts or talking points, but with the clarity, courage, and moral authority shaped by his life's journey. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment of doubt had prepared him for this stage. It was this very life experience that prepared him for his most public showdown yet. The debate hall was electric, charged with anticipation. Every seat filled with lawmakers, journalists, and aides who knew that tonight was more than a performance. The air was thick with expectation, the cameras focused, and the microphones primed to catch every word. On one side, the Democrats leaned into their rehearsed authority, their voices polished, their arguments calculated, their confidence bordering on arrogance. On the other, JD Vance stood steady, a calm contrast, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, scanning, calculating, ready to strike with precision. From the first question, the tension was palpable. Democrats opened with rehearsed talking points, confident in their moral superiority, citing statistics, invoking precedents, attempting to frame the debate in a narrative they controlled. But Vance didn't react with defensiveness or panic. Instead, he listened, his expression unshaken, his gaze unwavering. Each interruption from the other side a sharp retort, a dismissive comment, a pointed accusation was met with composure. He allowed them to speak, letting their words hang in the air, unchallenged for just a moment long, enough for the audience to sense the cracks beneath the veneer of certainty. As the debate intensified, insults began to fly. The Democrats, frustrated by his calm defiance, resorted to rhetorical attacks, questioning his motives, mocking his background, challenging his credibility. But Vance countered not with anger, but with quiet authority, dismantling their assertions with clarity and precision. Every fact he presented, every anecdote he invoked, cut through the noise, exposing inconsistencies and double standards without raising his voice. His opponent's flustered reactions became increasingly obvious. A stumble over words here, a sigh of frustration there, a glance at their notes that betrayed panic. The audience, both live and watching remotely, began to lean in. Viewers could feel the tension, the shift in the room's energy, the subtle power dynamics at play. They saw not just a politician arguing policy, but a man holding a mirror to his opponent's arrogance, forcing them to confront truths they had long avoided. There was a visceral sense of rooting for him, a collective acknowledgement that here was someone speaking for those who had been ignored, dismissed, and belittled. Every pause, every measured word from Vance amplified the emotional beat, creating a rhythm that the audience could feel in their chest. As interruptions escalated, so did the stakes. Democrats attempted to regain control, raising their voices, gesturing emphatically, trying to steer the debate back into familiar territory. But Vance's composure acted like a counterweight, neutralizing the theatrics and turning every misstep into a subtle reinforcement of his own credibility. The contrast between their flustered aggression and his calm, deliberate authority could not have been more stark. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cameras panned back and forth, Social media watchers tweeted every quip, every pause, every moment of tension. The narrative was building, the crescendo approaching, and every observer, whether in the chamber or thousands of miles away, knew that something monumental was about to unfold. And then, as the final exchanges approached their peak, the sense of inevitability became palpable. It was no longer a debate. It was a test of truth against performance, honesty against arrogance, composure against panic. The Democrats had thrown everything they had, but Vance remained unshaken, ready for the moment that would define the encounter. But then, he delivered the line that would echo across the nation. The chamber fell silent. Every whisper, every shuffle of papers, every faint cough faded into nothingness as JD Vance rose, calm, deliberate, his eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the micro-expressions of senators, aides, and journalists alike. But it was Vance's voice that cut through the tension, landing like thunder. "Let's be honest," he began, MEASURED and unhurried, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "For too long, we've been told what fairness looks like. We've been instructed who deserves protection and who doesn't. We've been lectured about integrity, while the very standards you demand of others are bent, broken, and rewritten whenever convenient for political gain." He paused. The camera lingered on his face. The audience felt the suspense in that moment, a heartbeat stretched into eternity. The Democrats, once confident, shifted uncomfortably. Their smirks faded into tight-lipped expressions. Some whispered to aides, some glared at each other, but none could interrupt. For the first time, the veneer of certainty was cracking. "Rules matter," he continued, "but not when they are selective. Equality is a principle, but when applied inconsistently, it becomes hypocrisy. And let's call it what it is. Hypocrisy is not just inconvenient, it is corrosive. It erodes trust, it diminishes legitimacy, and it betrays the very people you claim to serve." A subtle murmur rippled through the chamber. Journalists scribbled furiously. Social media notifications began to spike in real time as live feeds captured the scene. Outside, millions were watching, rewinding, replaying his calm, precise dismantling of a narrative they had once thought untouchable. He leaned forward slightly, emphasizing the next point with a quiet intensity. "You tell Americans to follow the rules. You tell them to respect institutions, to value truth, and yet, when it suits your agenda, you abandon those same principles. You attack some voices while defending others, depending entirely on convenience, not conviction. How can anyone take moral authority seriously when it is a performance rather than a practice?" The camera panned to the Democrats, their discomfort now palpable. Face is flushed. Notes were glanced at nervously. Pauses between responses grew longer. Every attempt to regain composure faltered, revealing the cracks Vance had been patiently exposing. Vance allowed another pause, a moment to let the words settle, to let the truth sink. Then he struck again, calmly but with rhetorical force. "And yet, the American people, the very communities you claim to protect, continue to watch. They continue to struggle. They continue to see opportunity denied, voices silenced, promises broken. The disconnect between rhetoric and reality has consequences. And those consequences are not abstract, they are felt in homes, in schools, in factories, in neighborhoods that have been abandoned by policies and misled by speeches. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Reporters and aides leaned forward, caught in the rhythm of the argument. The contrast between Vance's measured delivery and the Democrats' faltering confidence was striking. Every fact he laid bare, every inconsistency he highlighted, stripped away layers of pretense. The villain's mask was crumbling, revealing entitlement, arrogance, and miscalculation beneath. He raised his voice slightly, but still with restraint. This isn't partisan rhetoric. This is reality. Accountability isn't selective. Justice isn't negotiable. And integrity doesn't bow to convenience. If you claim the mantle of leadership, you are responsible to those you serve, not to the optics of power. You cannot lecture about dignity while practicing deception. You cannot demand honesty while manufacturing false narratives. The audience, sensing the mounting drama, reacted in real time. Gasps, murmurs of agreement, and visible nods spread through the chamber. Online, commentators paused, stunned by the precision and moral clarity of his takedown. The emotional beat hit hard. Americans watching felt vindicated, seen, and represented. It was not a politician speaking, it was a truth teller, holding the powerful accountable. Vance's cadence slowed, deliberate, emphasizing the final blow. So before you cast the next judgment, before you posture as champions of virtue, consider the record. Consider the promises unkept. Consider the communities overlooked. Consider the reality behind the speeches. Hypocrisy is not subtle. It is obvious. And tonight, it is impossible to ignore. For a moment, silence engulfed the chamber again. The words hung like a heavy fog, leaving no room for deflection. The Democrats, once confident, were visibly shaken. The audience sensed the shift. The hero had not merely responded. He had seized the narrative, controlled the space, and exposed the contradictions with surgical precision. And then the crescendo. America deserves leaders who do not just speak of values, but live them.